So hello and welcome to this online event that we have for you today from the Center for Geopolitics. We're very, very happy today to welcome Martin Dimitrov, who is Professor of Political Science at Tulane University and author very recently of his second book, Dictatorship and Information, Authoritarian Regime Resilience in Communist Europe and China. Prior to this, Martin has written widely on a great variety of topics, including this one, but also a number of things like intellectual property rights, political economy more broadly, various aspects of institutional politics, and also the persistence of Leninist structures and the surprising resilience of certain aspects, at least, of socialism or socialist governance, both in China and in Europe. And so what we'd like to do is welcome him today to speak about his book and his research, and then to have a conversation about it and other related themes. So welcome, Martin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Hurst. Thank you, Bill. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak about my work. And I also want to thank the Center for Geopolitics for hosting this event. I have prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen, and the PowerPoint takes about a half hour. So I understand the whole event can go as long as an hour and a half, which means that we will have a lot of time for a follow-up conversation. So the book is entitled Dictatorship and Information, Authoritarian Regime Resilience in Communist Europe and China. The motivation for this book is a question, a methodological problem that exists in the study of authoritarian regimes. And this methodological problem is, how can we study non-transparent phenomena in autocracies? Because there is a wide range of such phenomena, my book focuses on one specific example, and the example is how autocrats assess the level of popular support. Now, of course, this is a question which is not only of academic significance. The answers to this question, how much support do autocrats have direct relevance for the capacity of autocrats to stay in power. Now, there are two possible answers to this problem of autocrats assessing the levels of popular support. One answer is the solutions to this problem that are identified by scholars, and another answer is the solutions that autocrats themselves develop to this problem, which is also known as the dictator's dilemma. So the puzzle for the book is whether scholars and autocrats have the same solution to this problem. Now, let me start off by talking about the solutions that are developed by scholars. The first set of solutions are developed from stylized facts, widely known aspects of authoritarian rule. So these stylized facts indicate that the dictator's dilemma exists. The dictator's dilemma involves the incapacity of dictators to decide on the optimal mix of repression and concessions to the public because of their ultimate incapacity to accurately assess their level of popular support. So these standard scholarly interpretations tell us that dictators are unable to assess the level of support because of the ubiquity of preference falsification, where citizens are publicly declaring their support for the regime, whereas they're privately opposed to it. And so preference falsification, the literature argues, leads to sudden revolutions. Repression only intensifies the information problem of dictatorships and makes the regime collapse more likely. So what this literature generates is the empirical expectation that dictatorships will be short-lived. And as we can see from the following slides, some of them indeed are, but there is a subtype of authoritarian regimes, namely the single-party communist regimes, which outlast all other types of autocracies. And this applies both to the single-party communist regimes that eventually collapsed and to the 5 that are still extant to the current day. This suggests that communist regimes may have found ways to mitigate or potentially even solve their problem of information collection with regard to assessing the level of popular support that the dictator has. So we have a newer body of literature which articulates a second solution to the dictator's dilemma. And the second solution stems from public artifacts. And what I mean by public artifacts is readily observable empirical indicators. And this literature in general argues that dictators can mitigate the information problem. And they can do so by promoting elections, by encouraging protests, and by incentivizing the commercial media and the internet to engage in freewheeling investigative journalism and criticism of the government. Now, where I come in terms of my assessment of these arguments is that, of course, elections, protests, and liberalized media reveal information about the level of support that the government might have. However, this information is publicly available, which means that it is available both to the regime and to discontented citizens who can use it to coordinate collective action. And what I'm arguing in my book is that autocrats foster channels that allow for the internal vertical and horizontal transmission of information. So what they are averse to is avenues that allow for the public dissemination of information about their level of support. So we get to the third solution to the dictator's dilemma, and I argue that this third solution is provided by what I call direct sources. And so what are these direct sources? Well, they're generated for regime insiders. They do not circulate horizontally to citizens. In communist regimes, they're prepared mainly by the Communist Party, by the state security authorities, and by the state-owned media, which create special materials which are only meant for internal circulation. These sources are classified, and in general, they're difficult to obtain. However, there is a major payoff from engaging with them, and the payoff is that they reveal to us, scholars, they reveal what autocrats knew. So the book that Professor Hurst referenced, Dictatorship and Information, is based primarily on such sources. So I will now spend some time talking about my method, and then I will get into some specific illustrations of what this method can give us in terms of the study of authoritarian regimes. Then I will move to scope conditions for the theory, and I will conclude. Now, the method that I use in my book is something that I call archival ethnography. And of course, we're all familiar with the standard ethnography. Archival ethnography shares certain features with standard ethnographic methods, but in some ways it is different. So much like standard ethnography, archival ethnography involves immersion. And this immersion takes place during cumulative time. Now, what one immerses oneself in the case of archival ethnography, is in regime-generated materials. The commonality with standard ethnography is the hope that through this immersion that takes place over cumulative time, we would gain understanding. And those understandings are based on past immersive experiences. So the features of ethnography are that, of archival ethnography, is that archival ethnography is replicable. So what I provide in my book are full archival identifiers to the various items that I cite. Archival ethnography yields very rich data that are amenable to both qualitative process tracing and to various types of quantitative analysis. And archival ethnography can be combined with ethnographic techniques like in-depth interviews. So the payoffs of archival ethnography is that it allows us to open up the black box of information gathering, transfer, and use. In other words, it allows us to see what the dictator wanted to see. What I did in my book is I engaged in a prolonged process. When people see the start and end dates of this research process, they are oftentimes shocked, but it did take a long time. It involved 36 months of fieldwork spread over a 15-year period. This fieldwork was conducted in China, Bulgaria, Germany, Taiwan, Russia, Cuba, Argentina, and in several locations in the United States. And the fieldwork involved research in 30 in and out-of-country archival repositories, special collections, naval collections, collecting confidential, secret, and top-secret materials, as well as some research with leaked data sets. What I did during this research is I collected documents about China, Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, Cuba, the Soviet Union, Taiwan, and Argentina. China and Bulgaria were the main cases in the book. The other cases are relevant for the scope conditions chapter, which is a lengthy chapter in the final portion of the book. And the time periods that were relevant for my project are listed on this slide for the individual countries on which I conducted research. Now, there are different types of documents that exist in the archives, and I think it's important to distinguish between personal files and summary reports. The personal files they're difficult to interpret because they involve individuals. The ones that come to our attention involve high-profile individuals. So the ones that I have chosen to highlight on this slide involve, on the left, Agent Sabina. This is Julia Kristeva, the most important Bulgarian-French intellectual. And on the right side of this slide, at the top, we have Agent Bolek, who is no other than the leader of Solidarity in Poland and the first democratic president of post-89 Poland, Lech Wałęsa. In both cases, we have archival evidence that they collaborated with state security. The authenticity of this evidence has been disputed by both of these individuals, as well as many others, but they have not succeeded in proving that the evidence is manufactured. But the problem with personal files is that because they survived in non-systematic ways, it is hard to generalize about the frequency of certain phenomena from studying them. So what I prefer is the type of document which is in the lower part of this slide, and this is a KGB annual report. The annual report is listing the number of agents in 1967, newly recruited, and total number of agents for the KGB. And you will see that there are two digits. Well, there are three digits. There's 1967, and then there is this 24,952, and then the 15%. What's interesting about the 24,952, those are the newly recruited agents who constitute 15% of the total number of agents for the KGB, is that the numbers were so sensitive that they could not be put in by the typist. They had to be added by the head of the KGB himself, who at the time was Yuri Andropov, who then became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So these summary reports, their authenticity is not disputed. They have survived in much greater numbers. And I feel that they're much more useful if we're trying to arrive at conclusions about the frequency of a phenomenon and the generalizability of some aspect of communist information gathering. So these are the types of reports that the book is mostly based on. Now, what is the value of archives? Well, archives do a number of different things. And I argue that for us scholars, they reveal the epistemic anxiety of information collectors. They tell us what they wanted to know, thus documenting the existence of the dictator's dilemma. So the dictator's dilemma was an actual problem. Dictators were concerned about their level of popular support, and they actively worked to devise ways to get more information about how much support and how much opposition they had from society. The archives, or these archival materials, also reveal the categories of regime opponents who were tracked. They also tell us about the techniques that we use to collect information. They reveal various indicia of different types of discontent. They reveal how information is transferred and used. So cumulatively, what they do is that they reveal how the dictator's dilemma is solved. So after all of these preliminary remarks about what archives are and what they do, I want to go through a specific example of how one might conduct archival ethnography. And this example is based on a leaked data set. This is the Zhejiang Provincial Propaganda and Internet Supervision Office leaked data set. So this data set has led to a number of scholarly publications in leading outlets like the American Political Science Review and in China Quarterly. People have used it for various publications. And what I use it for in my book is to replicate an article and using the methods of archival ethnography, and to see whether upon replication we get the same results. And this is the example of one document from this leaked data set. So the article that I'm interested in replicating is Pan and Chen 2018, which is entitled Concealing Corruption. Not everybody has read this article, so let me briefly review its setup. This is an article about Zhejiang. So Zhejiang is a prefecture administratively subordinated to Jiangxi province. The Zhejiang Prefecture Propaganda Department monitors the internet for negative sentiment and reports to the Jiangxi Provincial Propaganda Department. So in 2014, between January and November, the Zhejiang Prefecture Propaganda Department, according to the article's authors, received 822 reports of negative online sentiment, but only reported 590 upwards. Within these negative online sentiments, 245 were about wrongdoing, which the authors equate with corruption, but only 156 were reported upwards. So the general argument of the article is that there's evidence of willful suppression and protection of the prefecture seat. This is the center of this prefecture, and of 6 of the 12 counties in this, which are administratively subordinated to the prefecture, and these 6 counties are named patronage counties by the authors. So willful suppression of information about corruption in the prefecture seat and the 6 patronage counties. And what I am interested in doing is reanalysis using the methods of archival ethnography. And this reanalysis engages with the general question of, are we dealing with agency problems, which is what this article argues, this suppression of information, or are we dealing with a basic feature of bureaucracies, which I call segmented provision of information? All right, so what we have here is this article and then my reanalysis, and there are major differences in just the empirical evaluations of this data set and what it reveals. So first of all, the article claims that only 590 negative sentiment reports are sent upwards. What I find is that the number is almost 3 times higher. I find 1,720 negative sentiment reports. Within those negative sentiment reports, I actually find that 80% are about negative sentiment, negative online sentiment in the prefecture seat and in the patronage counties. So in terms of the upward transmission of negative sentiment information, I find zero evidence of protection of the prefecture seat and the so-called patronage counties. Then in terms of the detailed reports of wrongdoing, it's not clear how the authors code wrongdoing. They're using a structural topic model, but then as we know with structural topic models, the decisions on how things are coded are never clear. So I use what I believe are clear criteria. So I'm listing the Chinese term that I use for wrongdoing. So using those criteria, I find, again, that there's no evidence of suppression of information about wrongdoing in the prefecture and patronage counties in these detailed reports that are sent upwards. So the question, of course, on your minds would be, how is it possible for two people, in the first case we have two people, so three people in this case, so two people who wrote the original article and then me doing the reanalysis, to look at the same data set and to have such different conclusions? And I feel that perhaps we have looked at different things. So one thing that I looked at is a histogram that is available in all of these reports on public opinion. And this is a histogram on negative public opinion. So I construct my 1,720 reports on negative public opinion from this histogram. And then the authors of the original article have looked at, well, something else. I don't quite know what. So the histogram is quite clear. And when you add up the numbers, it produces the 1,720. Something else that I look at, because archival ethnography involves just careful reading of texts, right? So this is not machine reading. These documents are not that, they're not that huge. We're talking of several hundred pages. This is not a huge data set. So it's certainly something that one can read on one's own without running it through the computer. So what I found upon reading these documents is that, in contrast to what the article argues, where the entire setup is about transmission upwards, of course, these documents are sent upwards, but they're also sent horizontally and they're also sent lower down. So what we have in these documents is lists of recipients of these materials. And the list of recipients indicates that beyond the upper level, which is the provincial propaganda department, all prefecture level bureaus, or various prefecture level bureaus, and various bureaus below the prefecture at the district level receive the same reports. So the reports is printed in 70 hard copies. The provincial propaganda department receives these reports as email attachments and never responds, because the leaked data set is an email inbox. So what this means is that if the prefecture propaganda department is lying to those who are above, who do not appear to be particularly concerned about the content of these reports because they never respond, it will also be lying to everybody at the same level and everybody below. And the problem with that particular interpretation is that those who are at the same level and those who are below actually need accurate information, because they are the ones who are most directly dealing with this negative online sentiment, rather than the level above, which frankly does not appear to be too concerned about negative public opinion at the level below, given that it never responds to these reports that it receives. An automatic message is generated when a report is sent, and the automatic message says, "Thank you, we've received your report," but there's no follow-up. To sum up and move on to some more illustrations and then some of the broader implications of the book, what we have here in this illustration of how one conducts archival ethnography is an article and then reanalysis. So the article has certain assumptions. The assumptions are that all internet negative sentiments needs to be reported in detail upwards. So what I call this the universal detailed reporting assumption. And then the second assumption is that reporting only goes upwards rather than upwards and horizontally and downwards. And the third assumption is that lack of universal detailed reporting constitutes evidence of willful suppression and protectionism towards the prefecture seat and patronage counties. So what I find is that universal detailed reporting is a fiction. I mean, it's impossible. There's just too much, right? So I have 1,720 negative online sentiments. And that's too much, right? So if every single one was reported in detail, those reports would be too long. And the provincial propaganda department doesn't appear to care anyway. The entities at the local level, they probably don't need that detail. They need to be told only about certain types of public opinion incidents that are the most problematic ones. So in any bureaucratic setting, what we have is illustrative detailed reporting. That, I argue, is a basic feature of any bureaucracy. Another finding from this reanalysis is that reports circulate both horizontally and vertically to regime insiders. They also circulate downwards. And perhaps most importantly, I find that illustrative detailed reporting does not shield the prefecture seat and the patronage counties. So this is one example. It's just one article, one leaked data set. But I think it does lead to some more general conclusions about what archival ethnography forces us to think about. And what it forces us to think about is the documents are not just repositories of machine-readable data that should be subjected to structural topic models. They can actually be read, not by computers, but by humans. And when they're read by humans, they allow us to focus on who produced them, how, and for what audience. And I feel that those are important questions that we need to ask whenever we approach government-generated materials. So this is the example of what archival ethnography does. Now I'm going to move on to some other, let's call them insights, because I can't think of a nicer word right now, but some of the micro level conclusions, let's say, from the theory developed in the book. And one of them is about the desirability of protests. So in the Chinese politics field, there is a very powerful and widely cited argument that rests on the assumption that the Chinese government encourages protests because it has no other sources of information. And what I argue in my book is that archival materials point to the exact opposite conclusion, namely that protests are considered as a direct threat to stability maintenance, which emerged as a top concern after 1989. And this is supported by archival materials, but also in the book, I reference a study that I did with one of my graduate students, who is now a professor, Professor Zhang. And we analyzed a data set of 65,000 cases of protest. And the data set that we compiled indicates that instead of being encouraged, protests are being actively suppressed in China, at least under the administration that took over in 2012. So instead of compromise and negotiation, which an earlier literature on protests in the 1990s and in the aughts argued is, if not the dominant, then a frequent outcome of protest, we find that overwhelmingly police response to protests in the last decade involves activities like guarding expulsion, repression and arrest, and confrontation. Negotiation and persuasion, we find, occur in as few as 1% of the protests. So rather than being encouraged, protests are actively discouraged and actively suppressed by the government because of this overwhelming focus on stability maintenance and the threat that they present to stability maintenance. And so that's one of the micro-empirical conclusions from the book. Another one is, for any of us who have been to China before the pandemic or since, and since the pandemic, it appears that this has become even more prevalent. We are, of course, struck by the number of cameras that exist in China. And this ubiquity of artificial intelligence mechanisms, cameras, and grid policing, I mean, one might wonder, so have informants been rendered redundant by the proliferation of surveillance technology? And this image was taken in 2016, so this is somewhat dated, but what it reveals is not dated. And what it reveals is that, of course, grid policing relies on humans. So this is a friendly grid policing coordinator in Guangzhou. His phone number is there, as is the scope of his activity, and citizens are encouraged to contact him through the various methods listed on this slide. So humans, I argue in my book, are essential to making grid policing effective and to allowing this technology, this surveillance technology, to operate effectively. This is why, I believe, the number of police informants has actually increased as technology has proliferated and as cameras have become more abundant, because cameras only give you so much, and humans provide you the context that you need, you being the state security authorities, to interpret the information that is captured by the cameras and, of course, by other technologies that are used for surveillance. And what the slides indicates is only the number of visible informants. There is a very complex nomenclature of informants in China and in other communist regimes. I go over it in detail. We don't have time today to go over the various types of informants, but the important point is that they actually have increased in recent years as surveillance has become more ubiquitous. We're moving slowly towards the conclusion of this talk, and first I will talk about scope conditions. This is a book that is developed mostly from the paired comparison of Bulgaria and China, but there is a lengthy scope conditions chapter that looks at the range of authoritarian regimes. And it argues that the full complement of information gathering institutions, which involve the party, state security, and internal media, only emerges in Leninist communist regimes. Now, all communist regimes are Leninist, but not all Leninist regimes are communist. So Taiwan is the one Leninist regime that is not communist. So Leninist is defined by the fact that they have a party which organizationally looks like a communist party. So the KMT is not a communist party, but organizationally it has all the features of a communist party. Thus, it is called Leninist, as is the regime that existed in Taiwan until 1987, so the period of martial law. And so this full complement of information gathering institutions that emerges in Leninist regimes features two different equilibria. One is a low repression, high redistribution, high complaints equilibrium. This happens in centrally planned economies. The other one is a medium repression, medium redistribution, moderate complaints equilibrium that happens in market economies. This is the communist version of it. When we move to Leninist non-communist regimes like Taiwan under martial law, we have quite limited internal media and very limited complaints. And the chapter 9 goes in detail about why that is the case. Moving beyond the world of Leninist autocracies into non-Leninist single-party regimes like Iraq under the Ba'ath, what we have there is no analysis of citizen complaints. They exist, but they're very, very few. There's no systematic collection and analysis of those complaints. And there's the complete absence of internal media and internal journalism, which exists in both the communist regimes and to a certain extent in Taiwan. Another type of autocracy is the multi-party autocracy, which is Russia under Putin. So in this type of regime, there are communist legacies. So there's certain institutions that persist from the communist period, but the general share of complaints is lower than it is in communist regimes. And the final type of non-democratic regime is the non-party autocracy, like Chile and Argentina during their periods of military rule, when parties were banned. Now, what we have in those regimes is only state security that engages in information gathering. So normally I don't have time to go over the slide. So the way that I introduce it is, as you move down the slide, the number of institutions is reduced, and the greatest abundance is in the communist regimes, and then there are fewer and fewer. And then we end with the military dictatorships in Latin America, where there's institutional poverty, there's only state security. But today I had the luxury of actually going through this entire slide and explaining the different types of non-democratic regimes and their information gathering institutions. All right, what have we learned? What I have argued in my book and during the talk today is that theories of information can be derived from stylized facts. They can be derived from readily observable empirical indicators like elections, protests, the internet, and the publicly available media, or they can be derived from classified internal materials, which I call direct sources. What is important to keep in mind when we think about these direct sources is that the document generation process was not driven by the expectation that these documents will ever be seen by non-insiders. They were produced for insiders. There was no expectation that these regimes would collapse and that the materials would be available to others. Or for the ones that have not collapsed, there's no expectation that they will circulate, that they would circulate to non-insiders. Now, regime insiders, I argue, privilege channels that allow for information to be transmitted only vertically rather than both horizontally and vertically, as is done by protests, elections, and the publicly accessible media. Finally, my book argues that archival ethnography reveals what dictators wanted to know, how they found out, and what they did once they had the information. Therefore, this method allows us to document both the existence of the dictator's dilemma and its solutions. With this, I will stop my screen sharing, and I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions from Professor Hurst and from all of you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a really enthralling and engaging presentation. I think that it should be very clear to everyone that this is a fantastic project that has produced a phenomenal book, which honestly, I don't think anyone else could have written or could even have undertaken this scope of research over this many different countries in this much depth. And I think really the strength that comes through very clearly is this combination of breadth and depth, both lots and lots of documents over several different, very different countries, using different languages, etc., but also the depth of actually reading carefully each of the documents, turning every page, reading every word, really thinking about it in that ethnographic, immersive way. I was actually going to ask you a question about Taiwan, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, I would like to remind everyone in the audience, among the attendees, if you have a question or a comment, please put it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and I will definitely make sure that that gets posed to Martin and brought up in the conversation. So my question about Taiwan was basically, do you have a theory for why it diverges from the sort of core communist type? And might we apply that to other non-communist Leninist parties, for example, the People's Action Party in Singapore? So, I mean, I get that it has all the structures there, but it doesn't quite have the party intelligence apparatus, I think, if I remember your framing correctly. It has the internal media, it has all the informants, it has state security, it has all these other arms, but it doesn't have the party intelligence gathering and analysis system quite the same way inside the KMT. Could you elaborate just a little bit about what this category of kind of non-communist Leninist parties looks like, and whether it might travel beyond the Taiwan case?
Thank you, Bill, for this question. I have to admit that, I mean, Taiwan is a fascinating case. I don't know as much about it as I do about the East European cases. So I think this is true that the party intelligence apparatus is not as developed, although the party itself, in terms of numerical strength, is similar to the most densely penetrating East European parties. I mean, at the height of its development, it's about 12.5% of the population. That's similar to the East German Communist Party and to the Communist Party in Romania. They do have an intelligence gathering apparatus, but they don't appear to have been as, I guess, as stringent at it. So why is that? Is it because Taiwan actually had military rule? I mean, that's of course a hypothesis. Is it because they had this overabundance of intelligence agencies? I mean, they had more than the communist regimes. There's an argument that they were integrated. I don't fully think that I believe that argument. They had a lot of intelligence agencies. The other difference, I think, between Taiwan and the communist regimes is that the link with the population was quite different. So my argument is that Taiwan did not develop a social contract in the way that it emerges in Eastern Europe. So there was no sense of, pensions didn't exist in Taiwan under military rule. There was no free healthcare. I mean, none of these things that Eastern Europe had existed in Taiwan. You know, I mean, maybe there was some price subsidies, but in terms of welfare, there was quite little. So as a result, I mean, there was a lower expectation of popular loyalty, and you know, there was more repression through the military apparatus, which therefore limited some of the pressure to develop a communist style social contract. I mean, I think that's my brief answer to you, but I mean, I actually want to know more about Taiwan. As to whether it travels, I have to admit, I cannot answer that question. I don't know whether it travels to Singapore. I'd love to know, but I don't.
Great, thanks very much. I'll ask you one more question very quickly, and then we'll open up to some that are coming in from the floor. The one other question I'll pose to you is actually a little bit of a delicate question in some respect, which is one thing that's revealed very quickly in the book, and especially in the talk and the aspects that you chose to highlight, is the degree to which, rather shocking degree actually, to which, in my view, many people who are experts on Chinese politics have kind of reached for easy assumptions about basic facets of the Chinese political system or the behavior of the Chinese bureaucracy and apparatus, especially when it seems they reach for or make attempts to generalize beyond the China case. When they're looking to try to craft a general argument, they often seem to fall into these assumptions or tropes that you've very conclusively demonstrated are highly problematic, that seem to arise from an unwillingness to look at the evidence in front of them. Why do you think we're so susceptible to that as a group in our field, that people would fall for that?
Right. It is a delicate question, but let's say it's more of a meta question, because I mean, it's a question I feel about the state of the discipline and the state of the field. I think partly what it is that we're all overwhelmed by data. I mean, I guess when you and I were in graduate school, most reading still occurred on paper. I mean, there's not that much that one read on screens. One typed on screens, but didn't read that much on screens. These days, people don't read on paper anymore. So everything is on screens by and large. There's massive amounts of data. And then there is, I feel, this sense that you can just run the data through the computer and you don't have to read. And then the structural topic model will give you what you need. And of course, I mean, you know, if you're truly dealing with huge amounts of data, I mean, that of course is a valuable method for analyzing the data. But oftentimes what is subjected to computer analysis could just as well be read. And after reading it, one would reach very different conclusions. So, but I think the general problem is a reflection of the fact that it is just an explosion of data. And one way to handle that is to just do big data analysis and not read. And I think that's, well, that just leads to different conclusions from the ones that we would reach if we were to do if we were to engage in more traditional types of analysis. And the way that I see the future is I hope that there will be a space both for those more traditional ways of approaching politics alongside the big data ones.
I think that's a very, very good way of framing it and an excellent insight. I would just underscore, though, that combining the more traditional approach with larger amounts of data and bigger data sets does result in a tremendous amount of time and effort being required in order to do the kind of work that you have done. For example, in this project, that it does take a great deal of expertise across different languages, different political contexts, et cetera, but then also a tremendous investment of time and painstaking and energy to do this. And so
time is a very precious resource. Yeah.
And some of it also can be, I fear that most people don't wish to or cannot be motivated to commit that degree of time or diligence to their work.
Or people don't have time. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
We like, it's like life has become
too rushed in general. That's true.
Yeah.
Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. There are two that I have in front of me. So I'll pose the first one first, which says, does the fact that the surviving communist-ruled states like China, Cuba, and Vietnam came about through armed struggle or were forged through armed struggle, does this fact contribute to their resilience compared with the post-World War II Eastern European governments that were brought into being or created by the USSR, for example, Hungary or Poland?
Yeah, this is a great question. And there is a lot of research on this issue. There's great interest on this issue. So there's a new book by Professor Lucan Wei and by Professor Stephen Levitsky on revolutionary autocracies. This book is making a similar argument that regimes that emerge of revolutionary struggle are in fact more stable and more durable than those that do not. And I have some thoughts on that. First of all, there were, of course, regimes that did emerge out of revolutionary struggle that collapsed. The Soviet Union is an example. Albania is another one. Yugoslavia is a third. Mongolia, of course, is also a revolutionary regime. So, I mean, not all revolutionary regimes survive. And then when one thinks about the arguments about why revolutionary regimes survive, the idea is they have cohesive communist parties. I don't think it's true that the ones in the non-revolutionary regimes were not cohesive. In fact, they were much larger than in the revolutionary ones. And then, the intelligence services are managed by the party. Well, they were managed by the party in the ones that did not emerge through revolution either. So I think this is an interesting question, but I'm personally not convinced that revolutionary origins are that they give us enough to understand why these five regimes have survived. It is true that they're all revolutionary, but so was Albania. It only lasted 44 years, and Yugoslavia lasted for 41. So, and Bulgaria, my country of birth, which is not revolutionary, lasted for longer than Albania and Yugoslavia, a little bit longer. Yeah, so I think there might be something there, but if there is something there, we actually need amendments to the existing theories that would tell us what it is. And I don't know what it is myself. I personally don't see it.
Yeah, it's always interesting, I think, to try to predict the longevity or lack thereof of different kinds of regimes based on their origins. I would agree that we haven't really found a good theory for that.
Well, and I think, I mean, it's a very interesting question, right? I mean, so there's origins, but then there's development.
Exactly.
And then the question, of course, is with origins, how tied are you to those origins and to the path-dependent aspects of it? And, you know, one aspect of this literature on origins is the cohesion of the group that is there at the beginning. And I mean, sure, I mean, there's cohesion at the beginning, but 7 decades in, they're all dead. So, I mean, how does that original group cohesion then translate into subsequent generations? I mean, this makes sense at the moment of origins. So perhaps, you know, in terms of revolutionary and non-revolutionary, what I find in my book is that the revolutionary and non-revolutionary regimes are quite different in terms of bureaucratic endowments, for instance. So, because I mean, I'm comparing a revolutionary and non-revolutionary, right? So the main comparison is China and Bulgaria. So in the case of China, what we have at the moment when the regime comes to power through a revolution is a skeletal communist party. This is a communist regime with a communist party that is under 1% of the population. In Bulgaria, the Communist Party has existed for much longer before the communist regime is created. This Communist Party has competed in actual elections because, I mean, there were periods of pretty competitive legislative elections. It has also had periods of underground existence because it was banned for a period of time in Bulgaria. But the party is numerically, as a percentage of the population, it is 5 times larger than it is in China. So this, of course, creates different setups at the beginning of the regime. So in the case of Bulgaria, you just have more Communist Party members and loyalists that can staff the various bureaucracies. In China, they're just not there. So there is this moment where they have to be recruited, but, you know, this can't happen that fast. So what I find is that in the revolutionary regimes, the initial period is characterized by more violence than in the non-revolutionary ones. So that is actually a consequential difference. And, you know, for me, this is something that I'm interested in. But in terms of the long-term resilience, you know, there might be something to the origins, but we need to do more research on that and figure out what it is.
Great. Great. And yes, as you've also highlighted, I think in the talk and in the book, beyond origins, it's also the institutional structures and the organizational behavior of those regimes. Even if there's cohesion at the beginning, you know, by the 1930s in the case of the Soviet Union, or by the late 1950s, and certainly through the 1960s in China, that cohesion is rather spectacularly fractured. And, you know, great purges ensue, but the regime survives and continues to survive for many decades afterwards. So I agree. I think that there's a lot to be examined there that goes beyond origins, some of which you've highlighted quite extensively here. There's a few more questions that have come in. Let me ask one that's related to this. I'm skipping the order a bit in which they've come in, because this one speaks, I think, to a similar theme. This is a question which the questioner specifies relates not only to this most recent book, but also to sort of your previous research. Have you found evidence that there might be a higher degree of ideology in, for example, communist regimes versus in absolute monarchies or other kinds of authoritarian states, and that this ideological presence has an influence on the prevalence of complaints made by the public to the state?
This is a very, very interesting question, to which it's difficult to have a clear answer to that, because, of course, I think ideology is extremely important. I don't know how to measure it comparatively, especially outside the communist world. I think there is less of it outside the communist world, I think, because the structures that communist regimes develop to make sure that this ideology is dispersed and penetrates society are perhaps not present in other regimes. And, you know, I'm thinking about the propaganda department of the Communist Party, but then, of course, one also thinks about the morality authorities in places like Iran, for instance. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. So there might be cases in you know, so Iran is not a monarchy, but in the part of the world that is beyond the realm of party-based autocracies, where there's also quite a bit of ideology. the content of that ideology, one would think, varies. But then we have some absolutely amazing research that also indicates that sometimes it could be quite similar. So one issue that I'm very interested in is what in Chinese is known as cultural security. Cultural security is used interchangeably with ideological security, which is a subset of political security. And the idea there is that foreign ideas, such as democracy, for instance, and human rights, can be a threat to the Chinese public. And they should be blocked from entering the Chinese public sphere, and then domestic ideas should be developed as a counteroffensive strategy to neutralize the impact of these foreign ideas. Well, so one would think that this is unique to communist regimes. And, I find parallels between Eastern Europe and China in terms of this ideological security. And, it's not coincidental that the political police in communist regimes is also known as the ideological police, right? Because it polices against this threatening ideology. And then completely by chance, one of my colleagues asked me, do you know Mohammed al-Sudairi's work? And I said, no. What does he work on? Cultural security in Saudi Arabia and China. So Mohammed al-Sudairi is a young academic with a PhD from Hong Kong University who has moved to Australian National University, who has written this fascinating dissertation that I hope will become a book soon, comparing ideological security in China and Saudi Arabia, cultural security, finding striking parallels. But I mean, this question was about complaints, and the complaints, for me, they're linked to more welfare issues. So if we're to look at the welfare dimension of communist ideology, there I actually think there's probably a substantial difference between communist regimes and non-communist regimes. So I don't find these social contracts that are quite typical in communist regimes. They don't exist in places like Argentina under military rule, for instance, or Chile under military rule. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at welfare spending in those two settings, and it appears to be quite minimal. So is that linked to the differences in ideology? Potentially. I mean, I think this is an exciting opportunity for me to think about something that is of great interest. How would one track it? But I think the general issue of how different are communist from non-communist regimes is, I think it might depend on the type of ideology that we're interested in. And sometimes there are these utterly surprising and fascinating similarities, like the one that Mohammed al-Sudairi has found in terms of Saudi and Chinese understandings of cultural security.
Wow. Okay. Another question has come, which says, what effect does the presence or absence of legal minor parties, I imagine something like the 民主党派, parties like those that exist in China and communist Bulgaria, what effect does this have? Do they aid or hamper authoritarian resilience? Asks the question.
I will answer the question, but I want to start with a comment of, yeah, all of these questions, they're about things that I actually have not written about. Some of them I've written but not published yet, but they are about things that I'm actually quite interested in. So what effect does the presence or absence of minor parties have? Yeah, so these, so in the communist world, so China has these 8 so-called democratic parties whose combined membership is equivalent to 1% of the Communist Party membership. It's okay, like 1.3%. So there's 8 of them, but the members are not very numerous. And the question is, oh, right, so what kind of effect do they have? We have a few theories about what they might do. In Eastern Europe, these parties were less numerous. So typically there was 1, in some cases 2, at most there were 4. However, their membership was much greater. So in the case of East Germany, for instance, which had 4 non-communist parties, their combined membership was equivalent to about 1/3 of the Communist Party membership. So what do? Well, they get seats in the legislatures. Their members get certain benefits. They, of course, work in close coordination with the Communist Party. And I think fundamentally, the function of a communist party is to control society by collecting information. I mean, that, of course, is my take. I mean, communist parties have many other functions, but that's the one that I'm interested in for the purpose of this book that I wrote. So these other parties that exist, they aid the Communist Party in fulfilling that function. So, of course, an important question is, how did communist regimes that didn't have such parties rule? For instance, the Soviet Union, there was just the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It relied on auxiliary organizations like labor unions and the Women's League, but of course, these exist in all communist regimes. So, yeah, this is a great question. I do not engage with it in my book. I engage with it a little bit in a short book that I have finished, but it's not published yet, for the Cambridge University Press Elements in East Asian Politics and Society series called The Adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party. So there I have a couple of pages on the 8 other parties, but this is a question that deserves, I think, more serious analysis and certainly reflection, because I think fundamentally what these other parties, when they exist, what they give the communist parties is additional mechanisms through which its understanding of society improves, and therefore its capacity to control society improves. And when they're not there, it's just harder.
Great. Next is a question that honestly, I'm not sure if I've understood correctly exactly what the questioner means. But the question says, were the communist regimes in East Central Europe, for example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., not totally dependent upon the situation in the Soviet Union? The Soviets were losing in the geopolitical struggle during the 1980s. They were failing. So were the communist regimes in Warsaw and in the region/bloc. And so I assume what's meant by this, although please do correct me if I'm wrong by going back into the Q&A box, but I think what the questioner is asking is, can't we just chart the rise and fall of the Eastern and Central European communist regimes based on the fate of the USSR? They're sort of brought into being by the Soviet Union, and they collapse as the Soviet Union's power and influence wanes. And so therefore, maybe by Occam's razor, there's a much simpler explanation for that.
Yeah, so this is a typical question. So this is a common response. Like, why do we need to know about Bulgaria or any other country in Eastern Europe, given that they were all dependent on the Soviet Union? Well, first of all, some were not. I mean, Albania's closest friend was China. Yugoslavia had a falling out with the Soviet Union. Ceausescu in Romania was a very difficult ally for the Soviet Union, and he refused to participate in some of the institutions created by the Soviet Union. Mark Kramer at Harvard has documented that the linkages went back and forth. So a lot of the processes that are of interest to us, processes that indicated change and the potential for liberalization, emerged from Eastern Europe, not from the Soviet Union. So if one were to only look at the Soviet Union, one would miss the most interesting political dynamics in Eastern Europe, such as the 53 uprising in East Germany, or the 56 uprisings in Poland, and then the 56 Hungarian Revolution, then of course 68 Prague Spring. I mean, that's all Eastern Europe. So one could actually make the argument that the Soviet Union was following, unless we start with the death of Stalin, and then that's the big thaw, and then that's how the East European events emerge. I know what I like to think is of mutual processes going back and forth between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I also like to think about the divergence within the East European bloc, that it actually was much less of a bloc than is commonly understood. And in the case of Bulgaria, Bulgaria is unusual. I mean, that's why it's the case I study. It's unusual because it had no Soviet troops on its soil. There's this perception that the Soviet troops were everywhere in Eastern Europe, and that's incorrect. So because it had no Soviet troops, this raised the importance of developing its own security apparatus and of collecting this information about popular discontent. So while I believe that there are these dynamics and interactions between the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. I think they're independent states. And then if we, I think if we truly inhabit this mindset that smaller countries don't matter, then there's a whole range of the world, a big slice of the world that we would have to write off, because we would say, well, they're dependent on the US, for instance, or these days they're dependent on China. So why would we want to study them? And well, because they may have links, but there's still domestic politics that matters, and the domestic institutions. And the Soviet Union is not going to govern your country. China will not, and the US will not. So you have to govern on your own, perhaps with the assistance of these external backers. And most countries around the world have some type of a bigger country that they depend on economically or perhaps politically.
Great. There's just a couple more questions that have come in from the audience, and then I think after these two, we'll draw things sort of towards a close. I'll give you a chance for a last word. But one of them actually, again, sort of challenges this category of Leninists versus communists versus military, in asking, when a state, and I think by implication here, a Leninist state, declares martial law, and the examples given by the questioner are Poland and Taiwan, does that state not lose some of its Leninist qualities? Or does it still remain fundamentally Leninist despite martial law?
That is a really, really great question. Of course, I mean, in Taiwan, in answering your initial question, Bill, about Taiwan, I thought that the aspect that it did have a military regime inhibited the institutional development to a certain extent. So in the case of Poland, we have a different setup where Taiwan was a military dictatorship from the very beginning. Poland became one in 1981. So in that case, what happens? A number of things happen. Curiously, there is a period of political liberalization which we don't really associate with military dictatorships. So can we say that Poland lost some of its Leninist features and that curiously resulted in more liberalization? I mean, I think that would be a description that I think does some justice to what happened, but I am extemporaneously producing it. So I think, yeah, certainly, I mean, being a military regime means that there is some deinstitutionalization going on, or the existing institutions do not work as actively as they would when the military are not in charge. And then what that leads to, I think, might vary from regime to regime. In the case of Poland, it actually had some very beneficial effects. So the idea for the Poles was that it's much better to have military rule by the Polish military than to have the Soviets come in. And curiously, that led to democratization.
Great. And then now here's the last audience question, which is another one I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure if I'm interpreting it correctly. But the question says, the logic behind the link between information/complaints and authoritarian resilience is supposed to be about responsiveness. Have you found evidence about the level of responsiveness that contributes to the regime resilience? In recent months, there have been increasingly visible deviant comments in China's social media, especially on TikTok, which I assume here's Douyin, and WeChat videos. Why are these not being censored?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, the logic linking complaints and resilience is responsiveness. But the types of complaints that I'm looking at in my book are complaints about welfare issues. Welfare, very, very broadly defined. But I'm not sure what this question is referring to in terms of the WeChat and Douyin, TikTok comments that are not being censored. Those are presumably not about welfare issues. There may be, I don't know, maybe
I think there were a number around sort of zero COVID and the end of zero COVID.
Oh,
and
back then.
Fairly recently, there was a fairly spectacular video about fireworks around the Lunar New Year time in a particular county town being banned that got a lot of play internationally. I don't know if these are the sorts of things that the question is referring to, but that would be my guess in terms of critical videos that aren't being censored.
Yeah, I mean, and so, I mean, should we think of that as responsiveness? I don't know. It's hard to assess. I mean, sometimes, you know, because the complaints that I'm interested in, they are not publicly aired grievances. The complaints in their standard form are private complaints. So a citizen writes to the authorities, typically in a letter, or, you know, goes to a government office where citizen complaints are being received. Other citizens are not aware of this. Now, of course, in the Chinese context, for complicated reasons that have to do, in fact, with low responsiveness, but also with, you know, certain Chinese traditions of how one complains. Complaints have been more typically group rather than individual. They have been more typically done in person in government offices rather than by writing letters. But notwithstanding, even today, Chinese citizens have the option of complaining privately. They can send, they can set a WeChat message, or they can send essentially an email. They can go to a web portal that allows them to complain. They can even write letters. They can go to a government office and engage in complaints. And then what's important for me is how many such complaints do we have? In fact, what I find is that in the Chinese context, the number of complaints is declining, and that responsiveness is also declining. And of course, those are linked, because the number of complaints is declining because of low responsiveness. When it comes to the internet, a lot of what is labeled as complaints for me is different from a complaint. You know, people vent, but you know, that is a different category, and it's not clear what should be done. In many cases, nothing should be done. The question is, because I mean, people just post and then that's it. They don't necessarily expect a response from the authorities. They may expect engagement from other people on these fora where they post. When something is not censored, does that mean that this is an example of responsiveness? It depends on what it is. In some instances, perhaps. I mean, so with some of these zero COVID, you know, the reports that we saw from the lockdown and certain types of videos that were not censored. Yeah, I mean, presumably that is an acknowledgement that the lockdowns should end, and they did end. But I don't think every single instance of non-censorship is linked to responsiveness. I mean, you know, some of it is just the politics of these internet companies. And, you know, I mean, Blake Miller, who is London School of Economics, is arguing that internet companies are motivated by profits, and they selectively enforce directives on censorship. And, you know, sometimes they make a decision that by not censoring certain content, they get to make more money. So that's not about responsiveness. That's about a business logic. So I think this is an interesting question. But when it comes to content that circulates on the internet, we need to be careful on how we interpret the lack of censorship. And I think my main point there would be that non-censorship is not always responsiveness. Great.
And so at this point, I just invite you, if you have any last thoughts or comments or remarks on any of this, if you wanted to go back into detail on any of the points that have already been raised, or if you wanted to raise anything in conclusion.
Well, I think what I want to say is that I mean, first of all, of course, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I also think these were very interesting questions, because I mean, normally what I get is a set of questions that I've already heard somewhere else. So these were new, and that was very exciting. So I'm very grateful for that, because they allowed me to think about issues that in some cases I have thought about but not written about, and in other cases I actually had not thought about them. So that is always a lot of fun, and I would hope that some of these questions will result in research and publications later on. where people who feel that they didn't get a proper answer today will eventually get one. So thank you for that. This was a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Please do join us for future events as well, both online and in person as you are able. And thank you, Martin, for a fantastic talk. I hope everyone goes out and checks out this book, which I again highly recommend. And thank you once again, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Bye-bye.